Part one of this class was devoted to understanding the major, both biblical and rabbinic sources, the biblical and the rabbinic sources that might prohibit or say something about forbidding intermarriage. We talked about how this may have developed through the centuries and the famous ban of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai in the attic, remember, part of the 18 decrees. And we reviewed a lot of sources, which basically came to the same conclusion. You cannot really find any normative source in that period that embraces intermarriage. All of the sources convey a promotion of Jewish endogamy and opposition to marriage, and opposition in many ways to intimacy with a non-Jew as well. In the second part of this class, and we're in the middle of it now, we're trying to formulate an argument that's, I know, pushing the boundaries and making some people uncomfortable. It's making me uncomfortable too, because you can see that in many instances I have to twist and twist and twist and twist. But the idea is to do that, to twist the sources, push up against them as much as possible to answer the following question. If I was to make an argument from within the normative Jewish tradition that intermarriage could be embraced in some way or some form, what would I have to do in order to make that argument? Right? So that's why I feel a bit uncomfortable with this, because I'm telling you, well, all of part one was promotion of Jewish endogamy, opposition to intermarriage. And now part two is, let's say I want to permit intermarriage for one reason or another. Is there a way to squeeze within the margins of these sources and make such an argument? So where we left off last week was the piece about the Ger Toshav. I introduced you, sorry, not last week, 2 weeks ago, the piece about the Ger Toshav. I introduced you to this character in Jewish literature who's considered to be a non-Jew who is as close as you could possibly be, theologically, behaviorally, even socially, to being Jewish. And this person exists. Ger Toshav means resident alien, but it's an idea of a character who, and this is the important part, who is no longer engaged in idolatry. And so the sources, and we saw many of them, that were concerned with idolatry as the major reason for forbidding intermarriage. Remember, we talked about primary concern, secondary concern. So those sources that said the primary concern is idolatry are going to have a difficult time understanding why it is we would be opposed to intermarriage when idolatry is no longer a concern. And with a Ger Toshav, an idolator is no longer a concern. Now, the definition of Ger Toshav is found in a really interesting source that we're going to review now, from a tractate of Talmud called Masechet Gerim. Now, if you look at a traditional Babylonian Talmud, you will have a hard time finding Masechet Gerim. Its provenance is very, very murky. We don't really know where it comes from. It seems to contain sources that are very early, but it doesn't have the same weight as some of the major tractates in the Babylonian Talmud. It's sort of a tractate that was found in some versions of the Talmud, but not in other versions of the Talmud. So we don't know what status it has. So in some ways, it's unfair for me to show you this source, because one could dismiss it simply and say, listen, this is not a canonical source. This is not an important source. But I do think we should encounter it because of the way, and we should review it because of the way the Ger Toshav is spoken of in Masechet Gerim, from a source that's that's very early, right? Probably 3rd or 4th century. I'm going to show you the text on the screen. If you have a printed copy, it is on page 6. So can you all give me a thumbs up if you can see Masechet Gerim on the screen? Okay. Now, David, would you do me the honors of reading in the English from Masechet Gerim the definition of a ger toshav? David, are you able to unmute? I need you to unmute. Try one more time. It's not working. Okay, sorry, David. Don't blame me for not trying. Okay, Harvey Dolman, I see you there hiding. What about you? Can you unmute? Yes. Okay, Harvey figured it out.
Who is a ger toshav? Anyone who commits to avoiding foreign idol worship, according to Rav Meyer or Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says anyone who commits not to eat animal carcasses.
So what is that? Anyone who commits not to eat animal carcasses. Have you ever seen something like that before? It's a strange thing to say. Well, if some of you know the 7 Noahide laws, right? One of the 7 Noahide laws is Aver min hachai. You're, if you follow one of the 7 Noahide laws, you won't eat from an animal that is either living or an animal that was killed in an inhumane way. Depends how you define Aver min hachai. So I'm not sure why Rabbi Yehuda singles out that one of the commandments. What I like to think, and what other commentators think, is that perhaps Rabbi Yehuda is saying a ger toshav is someone who takes on the whole list of the 7 Noahide commandments, right? The 7 Noahide prohibitions. Do you guys want to just review with me quickly? It might be fun. This is sort of one of these pieces of like, okay, little pieces of Jewish trivia that every Jew should know. What are the 7 Noahide commandments? Let's go through them. These are very important, by the way, in Jewish thought, because if you believe that Jews have a mission in the world, right? If our mission is not to make everybody Jewish, but our mission might be to help spread the ideals of the Lord, and these 7 are the ideals that God has for all humanity. So number 1, the 7 Noahide laws. You can note these or you can ignore them, whatever you'd like. I just thought it'd be fun to review them. Number 1, belief in God, right? The acknowledgement that there is a God in the world who looks after the world and takes care of it. Number 2, not taking God's name in vain, not profaning God's name in any way. Number 3, do not murder. Number 4 is Aver min hachai, taking the limb of a living animal. Number 5 is do not steal. Number 6 are a whole bunch of laws of sexual boundaries like incest and adultery and rape and things like that. All of those are part of the 7 Noahide laws. And number 7, which is really interesting, is establishing a court system, establishing a judicial system. Or we just read in the Bible a couple of weeks ago, Parshat Mishpatim, all the rules of interpersonal behavior. And according to those who believe in the 7 Noahide laws, the idea is these rules of interpersonal behavior are not just for Jews. They are meant to govern all of humanity. There ought to be courts and laws to define the boundaries of human relationships and property and and civil crimes and criminal offenses and things like that. So those are the 7 Noahide laws. And Rabbi Yehuda here, I think, is saying a ger toshav is anybody who agrees to observe those 7 prohibitions. David, I can see you found the unmute button. Okay, so you'll do the next source for me. Is that all right?
Are we on a certain paragraph? Because now my thing.
Okay, don't worry. Let's wait until the next paragraph for you,
Okay.
David. I'll give Harvey a chance to finish this.
Okay.
But just before we do that, what is Rabbi Meir's point of view? It's not the 7 Noahide laws that this ger toshav undertakes to observe. There's just one. A ger toshav is anybody who commits to avoid idol worship. Any person who says, I will not worship an idol is in the category of a ger toshav. That's a very, if you think about it, a very low bar for establishing who is a ger toshav. Okay, Harvey, keep going.
His spit, the items he sits and lies on, and his urine are impure. His bread, oil, and wine are pure.
So these actually are just like Jews, right? His bread, oil, and wine are pure. We can eat and drink from things that he that he constructs. I won't get into the urine and the things he sits on, but what this sentence is basically saying is, in those matters, he is treated like a Jew. Keep going.
He is under the rubric of the ban on monetary deception, oppression, and delaying workers' wages.
So there are some rules in the Torah. We can get into a whole discussion of, hold on, that means there's some people I am allowed to monetarily deceive. Let's not get into that. That's a big question. But the major point Masechet Gerim is trying to make here is, this man, the ger toshav, is included, is counted among the Jewish people for some very important laws. Monetary deception, oppression and delaying of workers' wages. You have to treat him like a Jew in those matters. Except, Harvey, keep going.
One does not marry off
to
him, nor does one marry woman from him.
So I highlighted this, I bolded it in the Hebrew. Ein mesi'in lo, ve'ein nosin mimeno nashim. And then keep going, Harvey, because I think it's really interesting where it's placed.
Borrow from him on interest.
So one may not lend or borrow from him on interest. Some of you might know that there is a prohibition. This is the Jewish Free Loan of Toronto, right? There is a prohibition against charging interest on a loan to a fellow Jew. Now, isn't this interesting? Masechet Gerim says that also applies to a ger toshav. You cannot charge interest to a ger toshav. So sandwiched between these rules that are meant to apply to Jews, but now we're including the ger toshav on the list, sandwiched between them is one big prohibition that still stands, which is, you treat them like a Jew in all of these ways, but you can't marry them and you can't marry off Jewish women to them. Keep going, Harvey. He is not
to be settled on the border, nor in a bad neighborhood, rather in a good neighborhood, in the middle of the land of Israel, in a place where he can make a living. For it says, he shall dwell with you in your midst, in a place of his choosing, in one of your town where it is good for him. Do not oppress him.
Very good, Harvey. So this is a really interesting source that I'd like everybody to note. I think it's really important and interesting. Yes, it's true that in this source, there is a major boundary that remains, right? You still cannot marry into, someone who is a ger toshav cannot marry or you can't marry off any Jews to them, right? But look at how many boundaries fall. And so this is a very early source. And you may have had in your minds, I know many Jews might have had in their minds, the idea that, well, the Jewish world just has two kinds of people, Jews and non-Jews. And there are rules that apply to Jews, and there's rules that apply to non-Jews, and boundaries in the ways we interact one with the other. Well, I hope a source like this challenges those who believe that way, right? And later, of course, we actually saw a source 2 weeks ago from the Meiri, where even the Meiri was saying, I'm not sure Christians fall in the category of idol worshippers. I think we need a different category for Christians. And Maimonides saying, I'm not sure Muslims fall into the categories that traditionally apply to non-Jews. I think we need to make a special category for Muslims. So you see all these categories that are being developed, which do weaken the boundaries between Jew and non-Jew. Here, his bread, his oil, and his wine are pure. Now, remember, everybody, where is the source that says that you can't eat non-Jewish oil or bread or drink the wine? Well, if you remember from a few weeks ago, those were part of the 18 prohibitions from the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. They were part of the 18. But what else was part of the 18? Also, the ban against intermarriage. And so what's interesting in Masechet Geirim is it's comfortable removing some of the boundaries with regards to food, right? This is a theme that is so constant in my classes. I promise you, I'm not picking this theme on purpose. But when it comes to food, Jews find leniencies. Okay, I don't know. It comes up all the time whenever I'm presenting material. So when it comes to food, we're able to bend the rules because there's no fear of idolatry, presumably. But it's interesting that this ban against marriage stands. Now, Masechet Gerim does not really say why. And there are very few commentaries on Masechet Gerim, so it's hard to know why. I mean, you can sort of presume why the ban against intermarriage still stands. But if you can get rid of these three from the list of prohibitions of the house of Hillel, the house of Shammai, well, why can't you get rid of this one too? If the primary motivator for that ban no longer makes sense. So thank you, Harvey. I think the Ra'avad, we'll just read it quickly. David, if you could read this, do you see it on the screen?
Yes.
The Ra'avad's piece? Okay. So the Ra'avad comes to explain why it is that we find permission for drinking non-Jewish wine of a ger toshav.
Some say that he permitted drinking it. He permitted drinking it because Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel held that since the ger toshav does not offer libations, he is careful about making sure that Gentiles do not touch his wine so that they do not perform libations.
So what is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's feeling? The reason why we can permit the wine of a ger toshav, there's two reasons. Number one, his wine is not going to be offered to any idol, obviously, because a ger toshav, in either view, right, whether you follow the view of Rabbi Yehuda or you follow the view of Rabbi Meir, a ger toshav is not an idolater. Now, one might be able to say, okay, I understand he's not an idolater, but his brother comes over and eats dinner there a lot, and he is an idolater. And maybe he'll take the wine and do something with it that would forbid it. But Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says what? He is careful about making sure that Gentiles do not touch his wine so that they do not perform libations. Okay, that's Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's point of view. I don't know if he has any proof, but he says, look, a ger toshav is not only somebody who doesn't worship idols himself, but he also looks out for the welfare of the Jews and would make sure that his brother doesn't touch the wine. Now, what about, this is what's really interesting, what about the rabbinic prohibition for fear of intermarriage? Okay, before you read that, David, let me give everybody a bit of a primer on kosher wine. Many people don't know what makes wine kosher and what makes wine not kosher. Why is it that I have to go to the LCBO and I can't drink any of the wine that I want? Why is it that I have to get special wine from the bottom shelf in the far corner, and they only carry 5 brands? Why is it that I have to do that? So some people feel, well, it's the same as any other product. When I go to buy meat at the grocery store, I can't eat non-kosher chicken. I can't eat non-kosher processed food. So I can't eat non-kosher wine. That is not true, folks. That is not true. Even if I could certify, I could call in the Satmar Rebbe to come and inspect Chateau Latour and check and make sure that there was absolutely no non-kosher ingredients that were inserted in a Chateau Latour, it would still be not kosher. Why is it? Why is that that I still cannot drink Chateau Latour wine, even if I can be 1,000% sure that nothing non-kosher has been used?
Are you asking the question?
Rose, how did you? Yeah, okay. Once you've figured out how to unmute, you can answer. Yes, okay. Rose, go ahead.
So the thing is this: that first of all, it has to be the harvest and all the different things have to be done by a Jew who is Shomer Shabbos.
That's right.
There's 2 different times. There's lo mebushal and there is mebushal, and that's about boiling the wine and not boiling.
That's right. So very good. The problem is wine was offered as a libation to idols. And so this is in the Talmudic period. And if you think about it, even today in the church, wine is used as part of the ceremony. Of course, there's a question about whether that's considered to be idolatrous or not. We won't get into that. But wine has a certain religious quality. And since it's very clear in the Torah that a Jew is not allowed to benefit from idol worship or anything that has to do with idol worship, there's an extra layer of kashrut that has to be followed with regards to wine, and that is what that is the making sure that Jews supervised the entire process from harvesting the grapes to et cetera, until it was put into a bottle and sealed. Only such wine can be considered wine. And actually, it's beyond the time it was sealed. It's until the time it is poured into your glass. That's this whole reason for mavushal wine, right? If you go to a catering hall, you'll only find mavushal wine because that way a non-Jew is able to pour it into your glass. Now, some might say, well, what are we worried about this for nowadays, right? Why be worried about my wine being libated to Zeus? I've never heard of that happening after a wedding. So there's a citation in the Talmud which gives an additional reason for prohibiting non-Jewish wine, and that is the fear of intermarriage. Since wine is served in bars and at simchas, and it causes people to lose their ability to make decisions wisely, there's an additional reason why one may not drink non-Jewish wine, and that is to prevent Jews from going to non-Jewish bars for fear of intermarriage. Now, I never really liked that reason, because you would think that if that was the main reason for prohibiting non-Jewish wine, why wouldn't we extend that prohibition to the alcoholic drinks that are much more potent than wine? Like, why wouldn't that also apply to rye or beer or, okay, whiskey and scotch? But as I say to you, again, Jews are very famous for finding leniencies when it comes to food. And, the Scotch will find every leniency imaginable to make Scotch kosher, but not wine. So what about the rabbinic prohibition for fear of intermarriage? Let's remove Rabbi Grover's opinion from this and assume that there is a real reason for prohibiting non-Jewish wine, and it's because of the fear of intermarriage. So David, what do we feel about this fear of intermarriage. Shouldn't we prohibit the wine of the ger toshav? I understand that the ger toshav is close to the Jewish people, and we're sure that he's not going to libate his wine because he's not an idolater, but the ger toshav, I'm still not allowed to intermarry. So what if I go to a bar where there's a lot of ger toshavs that hang out, and I'm starting to drink wine with him, and then my Lord, I'll come to intermarry with him. So shouldn't we prohibit? So what do we say to those who don't prohibit the wine of a ger toshav? Go ahead, David.
And the rabbinic prohibition for fear of intermarriage also does not apply to him, since he has so substantially committed to mitzvot. There was no need to apply this prohibition to him. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel holds that the essence of the prohibition for fear of intermarriage was all about idolatry.
Okay, now this is crazy. If I had, let me just explain to you what he's saying. We don't have to worry about intermarriage with a ger toshav. That's the first thing he says. Well, why? What do you mean we don't have to worry about intermarriage with a ger toshav? We just read from Masechet Gerim, you can't marry a ger toshav. If you can't marry a ger toshav, then I should be worried. Why should I be less worried with a ger toshav than I would be with the king with the chief priest of an idolatrous nation? You can't marry either of them. So if you can't marry either of them, why am I allowed to drink with one, but not drink with the other? Well, this is what the Ra'avad says. It's because the essence of the prohibition of the fear of intermarriage was all about idolatry. This, to me, it seems like a very circular argument, but he's going back to something that, I mean, if I had the Ra'avad with me, I would love to resurrect him from the dead and call him up on the phone and say, Ra'avad, do you know what you just wrote? Do you understand the implications of what you just wrote? You're basically saying, I don't have to worry about intermarriage with somebody who's a ger toshav because I'm not worried about idolatry. Well, you're basically permitting marriage with a ger toshav. Given that the ger toshav is distanced from idolatry, there's no concern. Now, I think the Ra'avad here, maybe, if I could have the chutzpah to say it, I don't think the Ra'avad really understood here the implications of what he was saying, because he was talking about wine. And as I was saying before, okay, Jews find leniencies when it comes to wine. So they say things that they really shouldn't be saying in order to allow the wine because it's good wine. But in order to make the argument of permitting the wine of a ger toshav, the Ra'avad comes to say something that is very dangerous. And remember, the whole point of me introducing this part 2 to you is to say, well, if I wanted to make the argument that a Jew could be permitted to marry a non-Jew, what would I have to say in order to make that argument? And you all can bet that I would take this source and show it to everybody, and say to them, you see, if you can permit their wine because there's no fear of intermarriage, then there's no fear of intermarriage. In other words, they're not worshiping idols, and perhaps it's not so bad for a Jew to marry somebody who falls into the category of a ger toshav. Go ahead, David, read this last line.
Even though there are many other mitzvot that he has not taken on, if we follow the view that the ger toshav only takes on the 7 mitzvot, still we do not forbid his oil or his wine.
Right. So he's not Jewish. Thank you, David. It's clear that he doesn't fulfill all of the mitzvot, but even if it's just the 7 mitzvot that he has taken on or that she has taken on, that's good enough. We do not forbid his oil or his wine. But what Ra'avad fails to do here is explain, well, why is it that we don't forbid his oil or his wine, but we do forbid his daughters and his sons, right? He's not explaining why. And in fact, he's making an opening here for those who say we should treat their daughters and their sons in the same way as we treat their oil and their wine. Now, I want to read one more source here on the Ger Toshav that I think is really interesting. This is from Rabbi Joseph Caro's commentary on Maimonides called the Kesef Mishnah. And Rabbi Caro, who is most famously known as the author of the Shulchan Aruch, right, the code of Jewish law, is here trying to resolve a part of Maimonides that is a piece in Maimonides' legal literature that seems to be inconsistent. Adele, could you read this first line here, and you'll see the inconsistency. Given that
Rambam holds that any Gentile who does not worship idols does not render his wine forbidden from benefit, how could he write that a Ger Toshav who accepts the 7 Noahide laws forbids his wine for drinking, but not for benefit?
So do you all notice the inconsistency? Let me just be clear about what the inconsistency is in the Rambam that will cause the Kesef Mishnah to say something very interesting in terms of the categories of non-Jews. Remember, I was talking to you all about, well, it's clear that as the centuries progress, there's room for other categories in Jewish halachic literature besides non-Jew. There's Ger Toshav, which we already saw, but now we're going to delve a little bit deeper into, well, are there different kinds of Ger Toshav? And what's going to open up that discussion is this inconsistency that the Kesef Mishnah notes in the Rambam. And what is it? That the Rambam says something about a Gentile who does not worship idols. Okay, now remember, let's go back up here. A Gentile who does not worship idols. That sounds like the Ger Toshav that is defined by Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says a Ger Toshav is any non-Jew who commits to avoiding idol worship. So if that's your definition of a Ger Toshav, what does Maimonides say about him? His wine is permitted for benefit, not for drinking, but for benefit. I can drink his wine. I can't drink his wine, but I can sell his wine. I'm allowed to get some benefit out of his wine. But then there's a different kind of non-Jew. A Ger Toshav who accepts the 7 Noahide laws, forbids his wine for drinking, but not for benefit. So how could it be that the Ger Toshav who does not worship idols does not render his wine forbidden from benefit? I'm allowed to benefit. But later he says a Ger Toshav who accepts the 7 Noahide laws, he forbids his wine for drinking, but not for benefit. This makes it sound like a failure to accept even one of the 7 Noahide laws would render the wine forbidden to benefit from. So this is where I need you all to be sensitive readers. We have in Masechet Gerim 2 definitions of who is a Ger Toshav. The first one is Rabbi Meir. The second one is Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir says it's anyone who avoids idol worship. Rabbi Yehuda says it's anyone who commits not to eat animal carcasses, which you might define as someone who observes the 7 Noahide commandments. Maimonides has 2 definitions that he's not really deciding on. You see, at least in Masechet Gerim, we had 2 different people. We had the view of Rabbi Meir and the view of Rabbi Yehuda. But in the Mishneh Torah, in Maimonides, he's talking about a Ger Toshav in 2 different ways. And there are implications with regards to which definition we apply. If a Ger Toshav is somebody who does not, who rejects idol worship. Let's play this out, Adele. Would a Muslim apply? Is a Muslim a ger toshav? Does a Muslim worship idols? No. Muslims are not idol worshippers. You're not even allowed to have it in a mosque. You're not even allowed to, just like in a synagogue, you're not allowed to have any form that might be confused with an item of worship. So Maimonides first says, let's imagine we're using, just to make this more concrete, let's imagine we're using Muslim wine. And I know, by the way, that you can't find Muslim wine, but let's imagine Muslim wine, right? Muslims they make wine, maybe they can't drink it, but they make wine and they want to sell it to a Jew. Is a Jew permitted to sell that wine in his store? I have, Chateau Cairo wine, and I want to sell it in my store. Am I allowed? Well, according to the first thing Maimonides writes, yes, I can sell it. But then Maimonides says, a ger toshav who accepts the 7 Noahide commandments is someone whose wine I can sell. Now, is a Muslim accepting of all the 7 Noahide commandments? Now, it's not clear, but one could make the argument that Muslims do not accept the 7 Noahide commandments, right? Because they have different understandings of establishing of judicial systems, of the laws governing animals, right? Kashrut is different for Muslims. You could make the argument that Muslims do accept. You can make the arguments that they do not. But the idea is that with this second definition, Maimonides requires that we go through the list of 7 and make sure that the Muslim I'm buying wine from indeed acknowledges all 7. Right? And certainly, by the way, if I'm talking about Christian wine, maybe there it's even clearer that I will have a problem, because Christianity doesn't really have laws of kashrut at all. And so Christians do not accept the 7 Noahide laws. That means Christian wine, according to the second definition of Maimonides, I wouldn't be permitted to sell it in my store. So can you read this line again, Adele, that I have highlighted?
This makes it sound like a failure to accept even one of the 7 Noahide laws would render the wine forbidden to benefit from.
So I hope that you all now understand what the problem is with Maimonides' inconsistency. Maimonides says you're allowed to sell the wine of a ger toshav, right? That everyone agrees on. But in 2 places, he defines the ger toshav differently. In one place, the ger toshav is someone who doesn't worship idols. In another place, it's someone who accepts the 7 Noahide laws. So which one is it? So let's see what the Kesef Mishnah says in order to resolve that question. Go ahead, Adele.
Why should a ger toshav who took on 6 mitzvot, including the ban on idolatry, be any worse than a Gentile about whom we know for sure that he does not worship idols, even if he does not accept any other mitzvot?
So here the Kesef Mishnah is asking the question, right? Which one is it? And why should we have different categories of ger toshav? Which one is worse than the other? And in Maimonides' eyes, in order to define laws based on one category or based on the other, right? All we care about with regards to wine all we're worried about is it going to be offered as a libation to an idol? So if that's what I care about, then why is Maimonides concerned with the 7 Noahide laws? He should only be concerned with one of the 7 Noahide laws, and that is the acceptance of there being one God and not, worshiping any other God. So that's the Kesef Mishnah's question. Why is Maimonides bringing up the 7 Noahide laws? And here he says something really interesting. Go ahead, Adele.
One, excuse me. One possibility is that Ramban only means to permit benefiting from the wine of a Gentile who is a member of a non-idolatrous religion. But if he is a member of a nation that is idolatrous, then he only exits the category of idolater if he takes on all 7 Noahide mitzvot.
So this is really interesting. The Kesef Mishnah here takes that Ger Toshav, the guy we've learned about, or the girl we've learned about, and says there's actually 2 different kinds of Ger Toshavs. And we can be more lenient with one than with the other. And when Maimonides says you can benefit from the wine of a Ger Toshav, he's talking about a Gentile who is a member of a non-idolatrous religion. Think Muslim. This is Maimonides. He's writing in a Muslim world. So for Maimonides, the Ger Toshav is not just a non-Jew who has accepted many of the Jewish ideas, but he's a non-Jew who's a member of a non-idolatrous religion or a non-idolatrous people. And that's really interesting, because what he seems to be saying here, the Kesef Mishnah, is if you're a part of a non-idolatrous people, then we're really not afraid that you're going to offer your wine as a libation to some idol, because you were never raised in any idolatrous religion to begin with. That's very different than someone who is a member of a nation that is idolatrous. So think, for instance, someone who's pick your favorite idolatrous religion. I don't know, Zoroastrian. Okay, I don't know anything about Zoroastrian, but I'm pretty sure that they do have some idols in their religion. So take Zoroastrianism. If you're a Zoroastrian, then you only exit the category of idolater if he takes on all 7 Noahide mitzvot. It's harder for you to convert to a Ger Toshav, right? I'm joking. There is no conversion to a Ger Toshav. But imagine there was. To enter the category of a Ger Toshav, it's more difficult if you come from an idolatrous background. You have to start observing the 7 Noahide commandments, all 7. But if you were never raised in an idolatrous background, you're almost automatically in the category of a Ger Toshav. You don't need to do anything. We don't need to interview you. So think here of the implications. The bar for what it takes to be a Ger Toshav has just been lowered in the world we live in, which is a world where Muslims are non-idolatrous. You could say Christians, according to many opinions, are non-idolatrous. So in that world, they are all Ger Toshav. we're not worried about their wine. That's great. I can drink Chateau Latour. I'm not giving you permission here to do so, but I'm giving you a way where making that argument becomes possible. I don't know any Jewish authority today that would say that. But if I wanted to say it, I know how I would say it and remain within the halachic system. And I could take this Kesef Mishnah and say, you see, even Joseph Caro believes that there's different kinds of laws that would apply to people that come from non-idolatrous religions, and we're quite lenient with their wine. And if we're quite lenient with their wine, maybe we can be lenient in other respects. Keep going, Adele.
This seems to be the precise meaning of Rambam's language when he writes that any Gentile who does not worship idols, like the Muslims.
So you see, now it's explicit. Go ahead.
This implies that only in this sort of case, where he is from a nation that is established as non-idolatrous, do we say that his wine may be benefited from, even though he did not explicitly accept on himself not to worship idols.
Right. So the implication is I don't need to do a background check on the Chateau Cairo wine. I understand that it's from Egypt, where most of the people are Muslim, and I can sell the wine in my store because that wine is considered to be a wine where I have no fear that it was used for idolatrous reasons. Keep going, Adele.
But if he is from an idolatrous nation, then he must accept the 7 Noahide mitzvot, and if he is missing any one of them, he forbids his wine from benefit, for he is still a member of his nation.
Exactly, right? If you're not Muslim, but if you're from an idolatrous nation, then I have to do an inspection. I have to check and say, well, what do you really believe? Do you believe in the same sexual laws that we have? Do you believe in the same kashrut laws in general that we have? Do you believe in the one God? Do you still have I don't know, do you have a picture of Mother Mary on the wall? Something like that. I've got to go through the list to make sure that you're not a part anymore of the people from whence you came, the people that you came from. Okay, I find this really interesting, this source in the Kesef Mishnah, dividing up who a ger toshav is and making this leniency for any Muslim or any person who was raised in a non-idolatrous, non-Jewish religion, finding a leniency there. Okay, thank you, Adele. Who shall I pick on next? Shelley, would you read for us this passage in the Babylonian Talmud? Let's just do this one last passage before we have a discussion, because this passage, I think, is it's going to upset a lot of you. And I think the way we ought to end class is to leave you upset. That's sort of what they do at the end of any good TV show, right? They'll never end in a nice summative way. They always want to keep you on edge and aggravated, so you tune in next week. So I'm going to use that trick here, Shelley. If you could read this passage in Avodah Zarah. This is a passage from the Talmud that everybody needs to know. So if you've all been, or needs to wrestle with, so if you've been ignoring the whole first part of this class, please pay attention to this part. Go ahead, Shelley.
Rabbi Simlai publicly taught in Netzivim, Gentile oil, Rev Yehuda and his court voted on it and permitted it.
So Rav Yehuda had a vote. Rav Yehuda is Rabbi Judah the Prince. He's the editor of the Mishnah. Now, that's really interesting. So they had a vote on non-Jewish oil. But I thought, folks, that this was banned by Bet Hillel and Beit Shammai. Remember the 18 decrees in the attic? I thought one of them was you're not allowed to benefit from non-Jewish oil. And then a couple of years later, Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, you know what? I really like non-Jewish oil. Let's have a vote and see if we can permit it. So that's really strange. How did Rabbi Yehuda overturn the ban from Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai? Sorry, Shelley, I muted you again. Go ahead.
How could Reb Yehuda Hanasai permit an ordinance from the students of Shammai and Hillel? Is it not taught? A court cannot annul the words of another court unless it is greater than it in number and wisdom.
So that's a very important principle in Jewish law about annulling precedent. If a court establishes a rule, I can't, a couple of centuries later, overturn that rule unless my court is greater than it in number and in wisdom. So that's quite the assertion that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi would make, that his court is greater than the court of Hillel and Shammai, and thus he can overturn their prohibition against, in this case, it is non-Jewish oil. So continue, Shelley.
Furthermore, didn't Rabbi
Bar Chana.
Oh, okay. Hannah said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, one court can annul the words of another court on any matter except the 18 things decreed by Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, even if Eliyahu and his court come and try to overturn them, we do not need to heed them.
Okay, so let's say you say, all right, yes, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's court was greater in wisdom and in number. They were a better court than Hillel and Shammai. But we have this other rule. What's the rule of Rabbi Yochanan? That you can never annul anything that's part of the 18 decrees of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. If Eliyahu Hanavi came back from the dead and tried to overturn the 18 decrees, we do not heed them. Now, that's a crazy thing to say. Don't you agree? Eliyahu Hanavi comes back. I mean, come on. He comes back from the dead and says, guess what, everybody? We can drink regular olive oil. We don't listen to Eliyahu Hanavi. Wow. Now, folks, who goes to the store and buys extra virgin olive oil? We all do. Is there a rule? I'm asking you now. Is there a rule that you're allowed olive oil produced by a non-Jew? Of course, you're allowed to drink olive oil produced by a non-Jew. You can buy almost all olive oil is kosher. Actually, almost all olive oil is kosher for Pesach. Never mind kosher during the rest of the year. So what happened? Did Eliyahu Hanavi come back? And maybe we're making a mistake, but we're listening to Eliyahu Hanavi. So what happened? This was part of the 18 decrees of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. We're supposed to not be drinking non-Jewish oil. And no court on the face of the earth could ever come and change that prohibition. So what does Rabbi Misharshia say? Go ahead.
He says, why? Because these decrees spread throughout most of Israel. The ban on oil did not spread throughout most of Israel, and our masters relied on the words of Reb Shimon ben Gamliel and the words of Reb Eliezer bar Tzadok, who used to say, you do not decree a decree on the community unless most of the community can uphold it.
Wow. Let's review that very slowly. So what does Rabbi Misharshia say? Why is it that Jews can drink or can cook with oil produced by a non-Jew when Hillel and Shammai explicitly banned it? Rabbi Misharshia's explanation is because nobody listened to the ban in the first place. Hillel and Shammai banned non-Jewish oil and a whole bunch of other stuff. We listened to the other stuff, but we never listened to the oil ban. And there's a rule in Jewish law that is going to leave you all on the edge of your seat until next class. Shelley, can you read it one more time?
You do not decree a decree on the community unless most of the community can uphold it.
So if people are not following a decree that the rabbis decreed, what this passage seems to suggest is you are permitted to overturn it. This might even suggest you must overturn it because it never took hold. Nobody ever listened to you, and people are no longer holding by it. So perhaps that is why Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and his court voted and permitted non-Jewish oil. Now, think of the implications of this line. You do not decree a decree on the community unless most of the community can uphold it. If I was going to make the argument that Jews today ought to be permitted to marry non-Jews, wouldn't you think this text would be quite useful to me? Among the 18, what is the intermarriage rate now? Is it more than 50%? You bet it is. Certainly in some parts of North America, it's more than 50%. Does that mean that most of the community is ignoring one of the 18 prohibitions of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai? And therefore, perhaps we ought to revisit this prohibition in the first place, just like Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi did with regards to Gentile oil. Now, this is a really, really scary passage because, look, as a conservative rabbi myself, there's lots of things that I think I'm decreeing. And then I look out and see what most of the community does. Well, maybe I shouldn't be making all these decrees if nobody's listening to my decrees in the first place. Maybe I'm not permitted to issue decrees when I know that they won't be listened to in the first place. Now, I leave this with you to keep you on the edge of your seats until next class. This is a really challenging passage. And I'm only trying to, in this section of the class, ruffle your feathers, so to speak, in order to have us think a bit outside the box about what arguments someone clever might use to have us revisit the ban against intermarriage using texts within the Jewish tradition, not just saying I can do what I want, but trying to use texts and interpretation from within the rabbinic tradition in order to overturn the bans.